Today, what I'd like to do is continue with the explanation of why I think these talks are important and what we're aiming to achieve by having these conversations. Now, the background idea against which all of this is being said is that therapy, in my judgment, is not as effective as it can be, as it should be. And my hope is to make it more effective. So what we're trying to do here, in my opinion, is to examine ways in which we can understand the whole therapeutic process better and ultimately render it more effective. Now, I'm starting off on this point with a kind of negative point of view. In other words, what I'm saying is that the essential assumption that's almost universal in American therapy today, and I think gaining all over the world, is essentially a medical understanding, that this is somehow a medical process. And then one speaks of disorders and one speaks of mental illness and that kind of reference, which obviously tries to assimilate the psychological problems we're discussing to medical problems, to problems of health in the strict sense. Now, in the first place, let me begin by reaffirming that I certainly understand the legitimacy of medical problems, and there are such things. There's a real history to it. After the germ theory of sickness was affirmed in the mid-19th century, apparently, historically, in the 1880s and 1890s, it became universal in the medical profession. And so it's understood that typhus is caused by a germ. Tuberculosis is caused by a germ. As you know, in the mid-19th century, there was almost something romantic about tuberculosis, that artistic people in operas died all over the place from TB, because there was no understanding of why this would suddenly descend on someone and terminate this short, glorious life. But very quickly thereafter, it was understood that there is a germ, a bug, that causes this disease, and it can be cured. And that is certainly the legitimate reference to all the things that are sicknesses. So it's not about trying to undo the progress that medicine has made, all right, in our time. And it looks as though we humans will live much longer and healthier lives because of the enormous contribution that medical science does make. Moreover, when it comes to the psychological problems, many of you may have seen the kind of illustrations where they show us synapses and cells in the brain and so on that light up and are participating when some kind of emotional, physical, or psychological effort is being made. And I'm not about to contradict that. Of course that exists. And of course those cells light up and participate in this activity. In other words, our bodies are fully participant in any activity, thought, process, physical activity, or whatever that we may be doing. But I must say that when it comes to emotional and psychological problems, when I'm shown the synapses that are firing and the brain cells that are lighting up and all the rest of it, I have never seen a single explanation when it comes to an emotional question as to whether or not the firing of the cells is causative or reactive. In other words, it's talked about in a kind of medical tone of voice as though it's similar to the really medical problems, that because certain cells are lighting up, it's clear that they're participating in the activity, you see. The same way a germ would be participating and causing a sickness as we legitimately understand it today. But it's not clear that that's the way emotional and psychological problems work. And when it came to investigating that kind of information in the recent years, the last decade, it's been subjected, the tests that the drug companies submitted to the FDA to demonstrate the efficacy of the various medicines they were proposing, it turned out that very often it was not clear what the relationship of the medicine to the problem really was. For example, when it comes to the question of serotonin, which is talked about as the fluid between the synapses of the brain and present when something's firing and going on, there were experiments that raised it and there were experiments that suppressed it because they had no idea what the serotonin was actually doing in the actual emotional and psychological problem that was being tested for. Moreover, it turned out then when the tests were taken with various drugs, that they couldn't tell what the effect of the drug really was. For example, in experiments where the placebo was altered so that it had side effects the way the legitimate drugs do, very often the placebo would turn out to be more effective than the actual drug, because now the people who were being experimented with were not confused by which was the real drug and which was the placebo, and that they reported contrasting facts. In other words, it seems that when it comes to the actual tests that would give this kind of information a medical foundation and what we call a scientific basis, it just didn't prove out. In other words, the suggestion that's being made here is that medical problems are indeed medical problems, and medical science is a legitimate medical science, no question about it. The question is whether or not the emotional difficulties that we experience, the life difficulties that we experience, are the same kind of information. Now, as some of you may know, in a former career of mine, I was an historian, and I taught history for many years, and I still am interested in what history can teach us. It's not something I've forgotten about. And it occurred to me that when I became interested in retooling to work with psychotherapy, that there wasn't a great deal of shift in mentality that was required of me in the process. In other words, what I was aware of was that when we know something historically, we know it in a certain way. If you're technical about this and you want to refer to it, you'd call it epistemology, the science of knowing. And when we know something historically, we know about it and we're sure that it occurred, but look at the way we do know about it. For example, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is given. All of us have at least heard the words. But what do we know about that process? In other words, we know that the agricultural basis of the cities that composed the Roman Empire gradually played out, that the soil was exhausted. We know that the expenses were growing, that the charges that these infiltrating tribes were bringing in, that they called the barbarian invasions, was costing them, and so on. But we don't know exactly what the weather on day 1 or day 12 had as an effect. We don't know whether or not the centurion was sleepy that day. We don't know whether or not the troops were exhausted. You see what I'm driving at? In other words, we do know that this empire was there for a long, long time and then is no longer there. But the knowledge that we have is not the same kind of knowledge that one has when one has scientific knowledge. It's not the same. Now, it doesn't mean we know it any less. You see, it doesn't mean that it's not. Now, it's very interesting that I would use this example because the language that's used is scientific language. In other words, when they label this as the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, essentially what they're looking at is a plant. A plant desiccates, dries up, declines, and falls, and it's dead. It's a biological comparison. And people are inclined to use that metaphor and apply it to modern times. For example, if we're not careful, we will decline and fall the way the Romans did. But no one's looking at the fact when he's saying that when the Roman Empire declined and fell, that human beings continued, that a process there was ongoing. And when one talks about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, what one is really talking about is the fact that gradually human beings continued to live and continued to survive and relate to one another in ways that were no longer identifiably Roman, but were something quite different. By the time you come to the 7th or 8th century, you're talking about the feudal system, feudalism, and the feudal nobility as running the show. Well, that evolved as the Roman system disappeared. This replaced it. So you see, it's a very different kind of action, phenomenon, experience than a simple death of a plant or a definite, clear ending, which would be truly scientific in that very tight sense, in that very precise sense. So it occurred to me that the kind of knowledge we have about us, ourselves as human beings, is like that. In other words, we cannot be rigidly predicted in a scientific way. Now, there was a time when this kind of thinking was very much in vogue. In the middle of the 19th century, from about 1850-60 to about 1920-30, they had the idea that human history, that historical study, could be understood according to scientific laws. And they tried to write history in that kind of scientifically based way. Now, one of the major products of this kind of thinking, it's known to everybody, was Marxism. Because what Karl Marx thought he was writing when he wrote his various treatises was that he was writing up the laws of history. And that was believed, that this was the evolution of human history. When Khrushchev said, I think it was back in the 60s, he said, "We will bury you," when he was talking about the United States. He wasn't talking about an attack on the United States or a way of destroying them. What he meant was that the laws of history will inevitably, scientifically operate, and inevitably you will decline and fall and disappear, and we will be standing at your graveside burying you when your society reaches its absolutely inevitable, unavoidable end. Well, look where that ended up. Finally, Mr. Khrushchev was wrong. Mr. Gorbachev was enjoying to tear down that wall because it didn't work. So strangely enough, one of the few attempts to really apply scientific history was the communist experiment. And look where that ended up. In other words, there's an attempt to turn this kind of knowledge into a scientific knowledge in a way that it isn't susceptible to. In other words, for example, I don't want to speak invidiously here, but for example, the science of economics. One goes to the economics department and one learns all the laws and formulae of how it's going to operate till it doesn't. Then they have to change everything. There was a whole conversation about that. Some of you may have been privy to it, when in 2007 the whole American economy acted in a way that disobeyed all the formulae and all the rules, because human activities are just not susceptible to that kind of precision. We do certain things, and then we do it differently and decided not to do it the same way, and so on. So it has a basis in this different kind of knowledge that I'm trying to indicate. And so as we're talking about therapy and the understanding of the therapeutic process, the reason I'm talking the way I am about the medical part of it is because I don't think that that tight, perfectly legitimate scientific reason in its own realm does apply to the human realm. We've got something different that we're looking at, and that's what we're talking about here to understand, with the motive not to overturn apple carts or any of the rest of it. I admit it's kind of fun to overturn apple carts. I won't hide that from you. But the real point is, if this thing is on the track of something real, the motivation is fundamentally to be as helpful to us humans as it possibly can and legitimately be. And that's that hope where we're going.